this is all about collaboration. And we believe that if you optimize for collaboration, you optimize for everything else, being, high performant, but just working well. Opening a PR and working with people on an open source project is nothing but collaboration. So at Redwood, our mantra is, by helping others be successful with Redwood, we'll make Redwood successful. So my vision is that anyone who wants to participate in this project will have the opportunity to do so. They can be from anywhere in the world, regardless of the skill level. Granted, not everyone's going to participate, but we want to make it accessible. We need to do that on the culture side, which I think we've established. And we are continually trying to work on the tooling and making it simple and understandable and accessible to get into a fairly complex code base and be able to contribute. JavaScript and Node doesn't make that easy for us, but we're going to show you a lot of tools today that have a workflow that'll make it possible. But most of all, it's working with each other that makes this stuff work. It's not about how good you are at the codes. It is about how intimidating it is to open a PR for the first time, right? We can help with the other things, and there's a lot of learning. So collaboration is what we optimize for, and I look forward to having opportunities to collaborate with each of you. Sound good? No, you're all on mute. I'll just believe you can listen to me. Hey, interrupt me. And I'm about to start screen sharing. We're going to dig into this thing. But the deal is, I love the thumbs. I'm not going to be able to see anybody's thumbs up once I start screen sharing. So you've just got to interrupt me, ask me questions along the way. Let me know that I'm not insane just talking to myself in a garage with a screen in front of me, that there's actually real people that can hear me. That would be helpful too. So let's get coding, huh? Okay, part one. I am going to go through the entire process from finding an issue, opening a PR, finding an issue, forking the repo, working on the bug, showing you how I can do a functional test, and creating a PR. Some of you have seen me do this before, but this time it's going to be even more seamless. And we're going to do it in 20 minutes or less. All right. That is my, what's our time at? Then we're going to take a break. So, and then, okay, got it. And we're going to take a break. I want you to watch. This is not a great time to take notes because we're going to do it again. No questions, even staying out of the chat. Like, don't worry about any of that. It's going to be overwhelming if you haven't seen this before, because it's a lot of the codes, but just watch, and we're going to come back and do a deep dive, and I'm going to show you more of the tools, but just watch me go through the process, because this is something you can do. And I want to demonstrate to you that this is, although you might not understand what the code is that I'm working on, this is an accessible process for you as well. So that is what we're going to do. And I'm going to start the screen share. Boom, boom. All right, let's hide the Zoom stuff. Yep. Hide that. Okay. And I can't see or hear anyone right now. So can you see my screen?
Looking good.
Nice, Dom. I knew you'd come through. And also tell me about resolution, because I need to boost my font size. So where to get started? I kid you not, I went to our GitHub issues over here. And yesterday I just started like scrolling down looking for bugs. And I look for bugs and Oktoberfest labels because we need help. We'll get back into this again, but we need help with bugs. So when I found one, scaffold force, when you throw the force option on the scaffold, it produces a duplicate import statement. I thought that could be something that would work for the contributing workshop. And there we go. Now I know some things about the code. I know how the scaffold works. So I have knowledge of what these things are and where to find them. I'm not going to cover all that in this first pass through, but let me show you, now that I found something that needs to be done, in this case, it's a bug to fix. Let me show you how to go through the process from start to finish. All right, so step one, I will need, well, I'm hoping you have a GitHub login because we do a lot of time on GitHub. Step one, I need to fork the RedwoodJS Redwood repo into my personal account so that I have a copy I can work on, right? Some of the things you may see me do are because I can directly commit to the Redwood repo as a maintainer. But for the most part, I'm going to follow the workflow that you will follow as well. This is a fork of it, and Oh boy, do I love, oh, code spaces is cool, you all. Look into code spaces, not for now. I love GitHub Desktop because visual, seeing things has always worked for me. Some of you all are command line Git extraordinaires, not me. I Google Git a lot, but yeah, Google Desktop, or sorry, GitHub Desktop, it levels me up a little bit. So this is just my nomenclature for local dev. TDP, that's the David Price personal account, and Redwood. Boom, I am cloning that locally. Boom, 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 boom. Results may vary based on speed and bandwidth. Come on, come on. How big is this thing these days? That's not too bad. I want to contribute back to the parent project. Let me see. Can you guys see that? And yeah, we're going to continue. That's going to set my upstream, right? So my origin will be the main Redwood repo. Look at this, another button, open in Visual Studio Code, right? We don't want this one. That's another project here. So we'll just have this open. So I'm just clicking buttons and look at this. Here I am inside the RedwoodJS repo. I have a local copy of this project. Not going to go through the code base yet. Again, let me know if I need to boost the resolution here. I keep saying resolution, but font size is what I mean to say. Should it be larger? And we'll spend some more time on the structure. Packages is where you'll do a lot of work. But just know there's two things happening in this mono repo. Thing one is we have to manage the code itself. And I will show you a lot of tooling and tools to manage the code itself. Then there is the packages, the code that we ship when people build a Redwood project. So if I talk about the framework, let's hide that again. I'm not sure if you guys can see that. Are you here? Hide. If we talk about the framework, I'm talking about this code base, the RedwoodJS Redwood repo. That's the framework code. If I talk about a Redwood project, that's me building an app with Redwood and using the packages to do so. These are the packages that I build a Redwood project with right here. And that's all we'll talk about right now. Something I haven't done yet is I need to initialize the packages in this. So I need to do yarn install. And that's just, I use yarn shortcut command. You'll notice something, this is new for people. We have yarn 3 in the repo now. Some things have changed. We can talk about that if we need to, but yarn 3 is like 100 times better than yarn 1. More on that later. So we're really glad to be using yarn 3. It took some time, but that's where we are. So got my Redwood code base installed. What's about to be done installing, but that's what it looks like. Another way I can tell I'm in the code base in in VS Code. We really like VS Code. It's what we recommend, regardless of what OS you're on. Is this little orange border down here at the bottom? That is specific to the Redwood framework code base. All right. Now, I need to work on some code. It happens to be in this CLI package over here. We'll get into that in a second. But what I'll need to do after I work on the code to debug it is actually test it in a real project. And we have a way to spin up a Redwood project, right? So that's a Redwood app. This GitHub issue says, hey, when I use this scaffold generator and when I try to force it and overwrite, I get a duplicate layout. So what I'm going to need to do to make sure this works is actually test it in a Redwood project. But I'm going to need to test the new code that I created here in a Redwood project. So let's spin up a project. And we have a build command to do that for you. Yarn build. This is a script called test project. And the only other thing I need to do here, there's a default directory, but I want to set the directory. And I'm going to set it into my repos. All my test stuff, I start with an X. That's just so I can clean it up really easily later. You'll have your own nomenclature. And we'll call this test project 2. This, when I hit enter, is going to build a Redwood project from the code base I'm using right here. It's going to install, the default is the Canary packages. So that's the latest bleeding edge code that's in our main branch. We publish Canary packages on NPM. We could talk about that. And it's going to create a JavaScript project by default. I could have chosen a TypeScript project as well, but it's going to create JavaScript. And it will do code mods to build out functionality like a blog. It'll add Tailwind. It's going to initialize my database. So this is everything you need to have a local test project. Note, if you're a Windows user, we know what the fix is. There's a bug for Windows, but we have a fix, and that's a great way you could contribute. And additionally, there's another way you can do this using GitLab. We'll get to that again another time. But check this out. I already ran this because it takes a long time. So in my repos, here is the test project, and I will show you what that looks like. So code X test project 1. That is a little helper. It launches VS Code for me. See, everything is a little shortcut key. I love this stuff. I love it. And here we go. This is the functional test project that is building right behind the scenes. It takes a little while. I wanted to build it for you earlier. And if I run, here's everything. I don't even have to do Git on this. Well, maybe I do. No, we got Git. Okay, I'll find out. Git status. I forget if we've got Git or not. Nope. Okay, I should do Git init. And we should add that. Git add, Git commit, Git commit, and init. All right, so we are now in Git, and everything else is done for me. So yarn Redwood dev I didn't even run the Prisma migrate. It's just all ready to go. And by the way, if you're not as familiar with the functional project in Redwood, this is a place to get started. It basically uses the Redwood tutorial to build a functional project, but you could take a look at this code base to see some of the things you can do with Redwood. And look at that, it's like magic, right? I have a Redwood project working, check the logs, everything's good. And there we go. We've got a functional test project that we can use. Okay, more on this in a second. I'm gonna put this over to the side and come back to the code base. It's all done. See, that didn't take forever. It just took a long time. All right, back to my issue here. We want to find out where this duplication is happening in the import users layout. I'm just, we're going to search for, it's in the scaffold. I know that. And users layout. Well, you know what? I know where this is. So let me step you through it. So a lot of times what I do is I will do Command P and start searching for files like scaffold.js. That's where I'd want to go, this one. Or I'll use a search functionality over here and start searching for text like Scaffold Import. But let me first walk you through where I got to this. It's in the CLI package source. We have all these commands. There's a generate directory. Inside of the generate directory, right? Good times, is a scaffold. And there we go. Scaffold.js is where we wanted to get to. For the record, the scaffold generator is one of the lengthier pieces of code that we have. You'll want to spend some time here, but hey, if you don't know where to find the thing that you want to help, if you tell us that you want to help something, we can definitely tell you where to get started. That's what we love to do because we want to help people get started here. And then I'm going to look for the import. So add scaffold import. Ooh, that looks like it. Let's go to, where's that coming from? Add scaffold import. Was this right? I'm pretty sure. Yeah. It's from the lib. Maybe that's where it is. Let's go to the definition. Okay. Add scaffold import. Override existing.
Hey, David, do you mind
yeah.
bumping the font up a bit?
No, not at all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Actually took a look at this. I think it's I'm in the lib. Yeah, you know what? It's not in the lib. I should have found this really easily. Import, return. Ooh, I think this might be it. Import layout names. Okay. There's not a more elegant way to find this kind of stuff. I was just trying to get there quickly, but you'd start reading the code. Let's look for this in the code. References. You know what? I'm pretty sure I'm in the right place. We're just, no, that wasn't it. See, this is also when where are my import statements? You can see me find things. Import, oh, that's what I looked for. I was trying to remember how I got here easily, and I looked for routes. Add all routes for the page, that's not it. But when I get to the add layout import, into the route, that's where I wanted to get to. So I made that super confusing. Yeah, you're going to be confused a few times. So sorry to make that look easier, but okay, here's where it is. And I already read this code. That looks crazy, right? But this is where that route is getting imported. I know a few things about how the scaffold works. And basically what I came down to was, and Dom and DT that know this, like help me think through this. But my thought was, I actually don't want this to be conditional on the force command. I want this to always do a match to see if this route, so this will generate the string right here. This is the string that I want. It's the import layout. Sorry, actually right here. Import layout. Sorry, this is the string that will get inserted here. Import users layout. And what I want to do is actually check if that already exists, regardless of whether someone's doing the scaffold force command or not. And I'll show you that here in a second. So I just did something like this. If, okay, I'm gonna build this out and then we'll run through there. But if this guy, import layout, if import layout match, and what do I want it to match? Oh, no, sorry. If routes content, see, I'm talking here. We're looking for the match on the routes content right here. So that's the actual file that's being read. Got it. So I want to look in the routes content. So I want to look in the file. If the routes content, if the file, if they find a match that's import layout, well, then, wait, if we find a match, okay, if we find a match is true, I want the opposite of that. Then I want you to write this file. And then I want you to redo a return. Huh? How am I doing so far? Is that logic kind of making sense? Yeah, I duplicated that. That's not what I wanted. I wanted to cut it. Boom, 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 boom. Right here. Do a little cut. Boom, boom. Okay, if I don't find it, then let's return. Sorry. If I don't find a match, it's going to add the layout. If I do find the match, let's say layout import already exists in routes.js.ts. Huh? Seem kind of good. All right. Nobody's telling me that looks terrible yet. Well, we don't know, right? Because I could test this, but now we want to see if this code actually works, right? Enter the test project. All right. Here's my test project. And what I want to do over here is I want to use the package code from my framework repo on the left side. And we have a tool to do that. It's called Yarn Redwood Framework Project Sync. Do know that behind the scenes, I'm passing an invar, and I forget what, well, here, it'll tell me right here, that I've already done. I've set it in my, my Z shell as an alias. Yeah, so did you see I did I did Redwood Framework Help, and that's where I get the info for these commands. There's a lot going on here, but there's this RedwoodJS current working directory, and I have already set that for this command to run. So just know that it'll ask you if you haven't done that the first time around. It'll say, hey, I'm in your test project, but where is your framework code base locally on your machine? So now I want to run project sync. And here's what's happening. We'll talk through this quickly. The framework code is being built. My packages are being built. The dependencies from my framework code, that's what's happening right there, are being added to my test project. And then it's copying over the built code from my packages into my test project. And lastly, it is syncing and watching for code changes. So if I make any changes to my framework code base, it will automatically rebuild and recopy over the dist. So I'm not sure if that totally made sense, but Anyway, there we go. Now, routes file, huh? Here's my routes file, and here is this post layout. Now, what I should have done to start was I should have duplicated this bug originally. Let's go ahead and save that. So let's revert all of this. I'm going to copy this. Boom. And over here, revert what I did. All right. That is saved. You'll notice when it saves, this re-triggered down here. Hoping you all saw that. Oh, no. You know what? I did something incorrect. Bum, 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 bum. I am working off the wrong. Do I want to back up here? Okay. We got the same thing going. We're gonna start from here. Never mind the person behind the curtain. I synced up, we'll show this the second time. I synced up a different framework code base on my computer that I normally work off on. And it's the same code right here, right? That's the same code. Yes. Okay. So same deal we're going to do. Don't ignore what just happened. It's all the same. We don't need to explain it. So I'll discard these changes. And if I go back to this, you know what? I need to close this out because I just want to revert, right? Don't save. Open scaffold.js up again, generate scaffold. Okay, those changes were reverted. Now, if I run yarn redwood generate scaffold post, well, we should see a failure because this stuff already exists. This is what I did the first time to get these post import in here. Good. Command failed, already exists. Now I want to do the same thing and I want to force. And what we should see is this post layout duplicates. We should see a duplicate import, and we do. We have confirmed that the bug exists. Now, let's revert. There's my code. Okay, let's just make sure that this is the code I wanted. No. That's the code I wanted. Save the new code. Watch this fire up. It saw the change. It's rebuilding the packages. It's copying the new built files over. And let's just leave this as is. I should not see another import here. All right, on the force. And it worked, right? But now, if I do this and I run force, I should see the import, and there it is. We're going to call that a win. Anyone else not think it's a win for now? Look, there's some edge cases we could test, but I think we're good. Everybody think we're good? What do you think?
Awesome.
Looks
Okay.
great.
All right. Nice. Live coding normally goes terribly, and this was actually like really good comparatively. Okay, so don't mind this part. It's the same code, I hope. Oh, I do have to get it back here. Okay, same code. Yeah, don't just ignore that part. All right, so we have some functional code. I am going to break this down here. We'll come back to that. And now what I need to do is we'll say fix for duplicate scaffold import. Let's commit that change. Oh, and you know what I just did? I do this. I forgot to create my new branch first. DSP, that's my initials. I know it's confusing with TDP, but it's, you know, I've just been doing this for a while. So this is how I do it. DSP, I fix, duplicate, scaffold, routes, layout, and that is for me. No one's going to care about that except for me. And like, if this gets drawn out for a month, I just want to remember what this branch was for. Also linking it to an issue. That's a good idea too. Create a new branch. I've got the branch. I can go back and update main reset from origin in a second, but we are ready to go. Fix for duplicate, and let's commit that to stage change. Let's commit that change. Great. Let's go over to GitHub desktop. Look at that. There's my little change right there. I'm going to publish that branch. Another reason that I like GitHub Desktop is check this out, create pull request, just right there. I love clicking buttons. Buttons are great. And here we are. I'm opening a PR on the RedwoodJS repo. My comment is going to be, it's a fix for, what is that number 3237, a fix for 3237 to do. We'll need to come back and add description. Also, we need to come back and do some QA on this. Do QA and etc. All right, creating a pull request. This is a hidden thing, but right over here is a convert to draft button, and perfect. This isn't ready for review yet. I still have a little bit of work to do. We welcome drafts. Drafts, the best way to talk about code is to have a PR in, and it can be a very early PR. We'll convert this to a draft. I may be looping someone else in here for review. If someone I know that I need help, I could add them here, but that's it. I have just gone from scratch to opening a PR with a potential fix for an issue on the old Redwood framework code base. And I did it in 26 minutes. So that wasn't too bad. Stop my share. It is break time. Let's take a 5-minute break. Good so far?
So far, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. See, you all could do this. And you can write if statements even better than I can. I kid you not. Well, we're gonna have some fun here next. Let's take a 5-minute break. So it's 9:18. Yeah. Again, like 23 after wherever you are in the world in 5 minutes. So 23 after the hour is what I've got. We'll see you then. And we're going to go and spend a lot more time covering each of the steps, and we'll answer your questions. If you have any questions you want to write before the break, just put them in the chat and we'll start there when we get back. All right, we'll see you in 5. Let's go back through and spend some more time. We are going to talk about the other things I probably should have done, which is test the code, run through the QA things and the CI. I want to show you GitLab as well. Those are all the things coming up next. So I've set the timer. We're going to take another break in about 40 minutes. We're going for 1 more hour. If you can hang on that long, please do. If not, understood. We'll get this posted online afterward. But the first thing I want to talk about, and Rob, actually, this is perfect timing for you, is what does it mean to be a contributor, and who do you need to be a contributor? Because when you're collaborating with people, it turns out all of the people stuff is a really big part of the equation. So code is one thing, but actually doing the collaboration is another. So what are the characteristics of a contributor? And because there's a real emotional experience to all of this. And you know what? It's hard to go, you're putting yourself out there when you open a PR with a bunch of people you've never met on the internets before, and they seem to all know what they're doing, and you feel like you don't. We've talked about this a lot over the course of a lot of meetups, but just you can feel there's an intimidation factor to it. So Rob Cameron, who we all look up to for coding expertise, Rails knowledge, a couple decades of building things. Rob, how does it feel when you go to a project? And I'm putting Rob in the spot, but I know he's on the Redwood core team, was one of the 4 co-creators of Redwood. But when you go to a project, you don't know the people, and open a PR for the first time, like, you've got experience and you, more than other people, know what you're doing, right? But how does it feel? Like,
dude, it sucks. You just get like, I don't know, but it just gets like this pit in your stomach. Like, everyone else is an expert. I know nothing. Everyone's going to make fun of me, and I'm going to feel bad about myself.
Yeah.
And it
right?
never,
Okay.
it usually ends up being an amazing, great experience, but just you build up all this anxiety in yourself, worried that all these people are going to look down on you and make fun of you, and you don't know what you're doing, and how dare you come in this community? Like, we're the experts. But it's never, any community I've been a part of so far anyway, has been amazing, and I've never had a bad experience. But yet I still, in the back of my mind, going, this is going to be the time. Everyone's going to make fun of me this time.
Yeah, right. Okay, so So that's Rob. So we know that other people coming to Redwood for the first time are going to be having that feeling as well, right? It's like if Rob feels that, if I feel it, then other people are as well. So what kind of culture do we want to have that creates optimal collaboration? And really it's things like being generous with each other and just grateful that people are showing up and thankful when someone opens an issue that right, may just be a question with something simple, or it may be a new bug that we've got to stay up late at night dealing with, right? Like we are working toward developing those kind of characteristics in the community, but we have to have them in ourselves first. So, right, because what you do in practice and what becomes the habits, like that's who you become. And in collaboration, if we practice things like generosity, communicating with each other about how we're feeling. I had a wonderful experience on a PR 2 days ago where someone said, after they replied and updated a PR based on some comments we had made, some code suggestions, they just said, I've updated the PR to the best of my ability. And I loved it because it was so putting it out there. And it did two things to me. One, and I know this, but it like made it clear to me that like this person is here showing up, they're volunteering their time and doing their damnedest to just be a part. And I'm like, I love that. And then two, it modeled to me that I want to contribute to the best of my ability too, like on that PR. Like I don't want to half-ass it on that PR. I want to help that person. So it was great. And that's what we think contribution should be all about. And we want your experience to Redwood to be something that you also take wherever you collaborate with other open source projects. So I'll stop there, but it matters how we contribute even more than what we contribute, because that's how we make Redwood successful. Sound good? All right. And Rob stuck around with our, he's still here. So Rob, it must be going okay.
Yeah, so far. Yeah,
so far.
That feeling that I get, I assume everybody has that. So I try to be like super nice and super helpful on PRs and never make anybody feel like, oh, you're a dummy, you don't know what you're doing. Like none of us really know what we're doing. We're all making this up as we go. It's just that some people admit that and some people don't admit that and act like they're the expert and you need to come to me for permission. And that's not the way we are at all. So
No.
I remember Dom had a really good story. Like, I don't want to put him on the spot, but like the first time I think he opened a message on the discourse and was asking a question and was worried that he was going to get picked on or whatever. And I just happened to be the one who answered it. And he said that the way that I answered it was so open and welcoming that it made him really feel like coming into the community. Not to toot my own horn there, but just that I just happened to have the right response for him and it's something clicked. And now like he's a core member with us. Like that first interaction was a good interaction. He came right in and now he's one of us.
Absolutely. And you don't do that just one time, right? That wasn't like a special phrase you said to Dom. You always do that, Rob, right? That's just a part of, that's just a part of the culture. So, which is awesome. We've had a lot of people be first-time contributors to open source in general with this project. And so it makes it possible for people across skill level and experience and language too, to join. So welcome. And if you ever have a counter experience, you let me know because we want to get better. We practice and that's how we make progress. But the project only gets better if the people feel like they can get better while participating. So, okay, let's go back through. Let's get to the codes again. Let me share my screen and we are going to do a bit more of a deep dive here in the process. So sharing desktop, hiding all the things. All right. Tell me again that you can see the desktop. Yes, yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Very good. Let's go back to where we were here in the Redwood framework code base. I'll just move that front and center. And a few things I said I was going to do is talk through the project structure a bit more. And then I want to show you some of the tools to work on the code that we have. So let's start there. Interrupt me a lot if there's something that I didn't cover that you have a question about. This is where we're deep diving now. Take notes and interrupt me as we go. What I mentioned here is inside of this directory, packages. This is all of the code that turns into the packages on NPM that get used inside of a Redwood project. The directory I didn't show you yet is this one called tasks. And inside of tasks, these are all the utilities that we use to work on the code and project itself. Framework tools is a directory to point out where we have a lot of scripts. Let's scroll down here that I'm about to show you what they do. There's a build script, which builds the JS and the types. There's a clean watch script. We've got a test and a lint. This publish canary script, I won't go into that, but that's where we have automation. When we commit new code into our main branch, we publish canary version. So that's the kind of bleeding edge versions on NPM of all our packages. And these are all used inside of that Redwood framework command that I showed you in the project. So one thing that I could have done to start was I could have said, hey, okay, we'll start there. Remind me to come back to an alternate way to spin up a Redwood test project. I want to talk about that, but first I want to talk about the other local kind of QA and testing things I could have done for the code that I created over here, right? So first thing is I want to make sure that I can build this. So I'm in my root directory, and when I run yarn build, that will build across all the packages, all the yarn workspaces in my project. And this is fundamental. If it doesn't build, then we've got a problem. So this is one of the tools that we would, this is one of the helpers you would run locally. If I was in the directory for the package and I ran yarn build, it would just build that specific package. But here you see that it's building them all. The first time through, it builds in JS. And then the second pass, it's going to build out all the types. And that's a two-step process for a reason. More on that another time. Will this build? I expect that it would, because we didn't make much of a change. The second thing that I would do, we have Prettier and Eslint. So that's syntax and also just code formatting. So if I run yarn, I'll clear that so you can see it up at the top. If I run yarn lint, this will look across the entire code base and do a prettier check. So again, are there any obvious syntax errors? Is there any formatting standards that need to be enforced that weren't? Sometimes you see those kind of orange squiggly lines. So not the red ones, and that is Eslint or Prettier telling us that we need to fix the formatting. Not much of an output there. It would have given me a warning. You can run yarn lint fix. Often when it does, but it would tell you what the warning are, and we don't have any in this case. The last thing, actually not the last thing, the third out of four thing I can do locally is do test. And we have a test suite, just test suite that we run. We have a lot of unit tests. I'm about to find out if I need to update the test for this. There is a unit test I already know for the scaffold. Ooh, I should, while this is running, show you that directory. Inside of this scaffold package is a test directory that has snapshots. I might need to update a snapshot here. We'll find out. I don't think so. Fixtures. So this is a code that gets used, kind of code snippets that get used in the test, and the tests themselves. Notice though, that's just for the scaffold. There's another level of test for the generate command, right? So for each, we have a directory of commands here. There's other tests, those get used. And then inside of the commands directory are some tests, right? So all of those are being run. If you don't know how to do unit tests, don't let that stop you, because there's no better way to learn how to do testing than to try to commit to a project that has unit tests existing, because you can use those as a reference, and sometimes it's just small updates. And then also we'll help you with that. We'll let you know if we need to add a test, and we'll help direct you, the maintainers of the project, in creating a test for the first time if you need to. So don't let that stop you. And our test suite just wrapped up, which is great. If I was in and again, I'm in the CLI package up here. If I was in the CLI directory and ran yarn test, it would just run the test for that package, which is helpful to know. So all of our tests are good. There is one more very helpful tool, and I'm not going to run through this entirely here because it takes about 5 to 10 minutes. But there is in our tasks directory, remember this is all of our tools, there is a E to E project here, and we have Cypress E to E tests. And the way to run that, if sometimes I forget, there's the script. Well, is that down there? I'm not sure if it's in scripts here or not. Nope, we don't have it there. I was looking for helper. Oh, something I didn't show you. Oh, you know what I just did there? I hit Command P, and that searches through all the files. So once I'm familiar with the directory structure, I can just start typing in the file names that I need. And in the root is a contributing Markdown file. And this is one of the things I meant to show you first off. Also, I have a Markdown preview here. This has almost everything that I'm walking you through as information about how to contribute to this project in here. And right there, integration tests is what I wanted to show you. This is our Cypress E to E, and that's the command to run it. All you're doing is running the script that's in this directory, in our tasks directory. It's right here. So if I run tasks, run E to E, let me tell you what this does, although I'm not going to walk all the way through it right now. It spins up a temporary test project. So similar to what I showed you at the beginning of this, we'll talk about a test project here in a second. It spins that up in a temporary directory. It goes through the whole process of setting up and linking the packages. Remember, I talked about Redwood framework, so that this directory, this temporary package, this temporary project is using the code base that I'm working on here in the framework. And it will then spin up a Cypress. It'll run Cypress in the background. So you can see it's going through the installation. This takes a while to get set up. It spins up Cypress, and then you'll see, well, I'll let it run all the way to then you'll see these 4 Cypress integration tests: tutorial, CLI, storybook, and logger. You'll see that you can run any or all of those, and you can go through each one and debug or update the tests as needed. Typically, I let the PR CI handle this for me, and we'll talk about that at the end. If I see something breaking, then I come back locally and run through the E to E tests. But that's what I do if there's something that needs to be updated. So I normally don't do this locally before I create a PR. I will come back to it after I create a PR. I'll let that keep running, but everything I just covered that's all of our CI tooling. So I covered build, lint, test, and E to E. And there's a little bit more, but those are the 4 main things that we have for continuous integration. So to check that our code is good. Before I move on to a few other things about the test project, any questions about those local tools? And I can't see you, so you'd have to unmute yourself and talk.
No further questions.
Okay. Okay, I'll keep going. One important reason I wanted to show you those tools is you see them over here on the PR. They show up. Oh boy, look at that. Cypress E to E tests. we've got a problem. They show up right here in our CI. Look, you're seeing a lot of different checks happening, and that's because we have to run against Windows and Ubuntu, Node 16 and Node 14. We're going to support Node 16 now. It is going to be it is the LTS release as of the end of October, so that's coming up. And we need to make sure that our code works across all those different contexts. But it's just those 4, and that's what's happening. So if I look inside of this, click on details. I'm going to open that up in a new tab. I can see where the run was happening right here. Uh-oh. That's our bug, Dom. That's our bug. Where could have that come from? Okay, no, don't worry about that. I'm thinking we're going to skip past that right now. That was a bug that got resolved yesterday. and we'll come back and check it out. But I might need to update for main. But this is not something you would see. But actually, because our CI started failing yesterday, we were able to diagnose a upstream bug in some sub dependency of Webpack CLI that got updated. And because of the way that they're using semantic versioning in the package JSON, we would have never caught that without CI. And then so people reported it so we could diagnose it further. But the CI stuff is really, really helpful. So again, main thing I wanted to show you is that everything that I did locally, now you know where these CI checks are coming from. They're just running those same, they're using the same tools and running those same scripts. All right. The other thing, oh, see, this is where live streaming starts going sideways. Look, we could come back to this. I know what's going on, but this is that bug from yesterday that we had resolved that I need to come back to. So we can check that out, but I don't want to dive into what's going on here. That's not helpful for this. It'll keep us, if I explain what's happening, it's just going to keep you from seeing more things. So we'll skip all that for now. And okay, what did I want to do next? I remember. Next up was this test project. So if you remember, I built a test project by running yarn build test project and path to the directory I wanted it to be in. So that's what spun up this test project over here, which is a functional test project. And unfortunately, we have a Windows bug on this, but I can tell you where the Windows bug is. Let's go over to pull requests. Right down here, Danny opened this. Check this out. Try fixing test pod code modification on Windows. So we know what's going on and we will be able to fix that. But in the meantime, you on Windows, if you want to build a test project using the code base, there is another trick to do this. And I'll just mention this quickly, but I can run, all right? So if I was wanting to create a new Redwood project, I would run yarn. What's happening here? Yarn Redwood, yarn create. Remember this one? How you get spun up a new Redwood project for the first time, Redwood app. Well, there's a script that runs that over here in packages, create Redwood app in the source right here. And so what I can do is I can do yarn Babel node, and that's to run this script locally. And then just go through, I'm having a weird lag here. Let me exit this terminal. I think I have a background process that didn't die. Do I have Cypress up? Nope, okay. Oh, I might have that port up. Nope, it would have failed. Okay, sorry, keep going here. Yarn Babel node, and then just go to packages. Come on, packages, and that's in create Redwood app, source, create Redwood app, and then path to the project. I could do everything else I need to do here, but what this will do is it'll spin up a fresh code base for Redwood project using this code in front of me versus going to the NPM and getting the published package. I don't want to spend too much more time on that, but it's an alternative method for spinning up a local test project. All right. There is a much better way to do this. If you are on Windows or Mac or anything else, we are now using Gitpod as an integration with our CI. Open an online workspace in Gitpod. For every PR or for every branch, you can create a Gitpod environment to work on the Redwood framework code base. And I had prepared one. Let me show you what's going on here. So clicking this button, boom, right there, details. Or if you go into this contributing document, remember I mentioned this thing, let me go back to the top. Right here is browser-based setup. Here's some information about Gitpod. I could click on that link there. And it takes me to a Gitpod workspace. I already set this one up. Let me open it up. And in this case, I'm just creating a workspace with the main code branch for RedwoodJS. I had already spun it up but every time you create a PR or create a branch, it will create a workspace inside of Gitpod with that specific code base. And what this is doing behind the scenes is it's building a functional test project. It is going through all the steps for the Redwood framework project sync. I want to come back to that. I'll show you a few more things there to make sure that the test project in this workspace is using the code from the framework branch that you're working on. And then it spins up the dev server so you can see that everything's working at that time. So Gitpod automatically does all those steps for you and then provides you a browser-based VS Code editor to work on the code from there. And if you log in with your GitHub account and your Gitpod account, if you create one, you can create branches, push to repos. You can do that all virtually, as well as you can SSH from your desktop VS Code into Gitpod itself. So that's pretty cool. And I'll kid you not, I thought this container would be ready to go by now, but I definitely talked to, there we go. Come on, load that pre-build. Do it, loading the pre-build. And will it build? Opening the IDE, that's good. These are good things. All right, here we go. Right, this is VS Code. And several things spun up here for me. This is what you would see for the first time when you came in. And I'll go ahead. Now, I don't need to do these right now. That's the preview. Oh, is this where it doesn't work? Oh, there we go. I'm like, live stream. Okay. Everything I just told you just happened. Let me try to boost the size here. This is two things in one workspace. Here's my directory tree structure up here. This is the Redwood framework code base that I just told you about. This is the test project that just got spun up, and you're just seeing both of those directories side by side. These were checked out and created automatically for me. I am working on the main branch. So I could create a new branch right here, DSP test Gitpod, create a new branch, and there we go. I don't need this tab open anymore. Down here in my console, you'll notice a couple things happened. Right here, it says it's waiting for the dev server, The code has already been synced one time, but if I want to continuously, if I want to watch and rebuild with a sync, I would need to run yarn Redwood framework project sync. I showed you that here below, but right now it's already been synced one time. It's just not watching. And then on the right side, it just ran the dev server, yarn Redwood dev right here. It ran the dev server and it opened it up a preview tab right here. So this is the functional test project. Check that out, all happening inside of a test browser, right? See, this is pretty cool. I could have opened this when the dev server spun up. It asked me if I wanted to open it in another external tab. There we go. So now I have it in another tab. And then the other thing I can do is I can open this up via my local VS Code. I could shell into this virtual workspace from my local VS Code. Pretty cool, right? Okay, I'm pausing. Questions about what just happened in Gitpod, because this is a really powerful tool and you all need to try it out. Questions? I've got a few more things to show you, but questions so far?
Is Gitpod kind of like code spaces?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, cool.
Yep. Does a few more things. Was that Jacob?
It is. It
Okay.
was. Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's great. Yes, it is like code spaces. And actually, the mothership for all of these virtual browser-based experiences that are happening is the VS Code people created a VS Code browser-based editor, and other people are building on top of that, which is pretty phenomenal. And I could talk about the differences between the two. So a few other things that I did behind the scenes is these are on my Gitpod. Look at that, the Gitpod command palettes. I could open in VS Code, open the dashboards. I will do that. So I want to show you my Gitpod account, and these are all the workspaces. You can use Gitpod for any GitHub or GitLab project. We work in GitHub, and here's all the projects. You could, I don't have my own project. I work on the Redwood framework ones. Here's my workspaces. Here's my settings. They have a really generous free tier, 50 hours a month for free with a 30-minute timeout, which is great. So that allows us to make this available for anyone to contribute back to Redwood. That's how we can spin those up, because it's by people using it, not for our account. So this is great. And I just logged in with my GitHub account. I have 47 hours remaining this month, which is great. The other thing to do is, what else did I want to show you? Oh, over here back in this browser is I synced this up with, I synced this up with my, I don't know if you know this, but in VS Code, you can create a login and sync your settings. So I logged in to VS Code, and that syncs my settings anywhere I use VS Code. So all of my extensions, anything else I personalize, all of that comes with me. So it shows up here, which is also rad sauce. And here's where I logged into GitHub. So now I'm logged in via GitHub. So that means I can pull, push, check out my own repos. I can create branches, and all this stuff is connected to GitHub, so I can work just like I'm working locally, which is phenomenal. It's really exceptional. And so Evans, other people with having Windows issues when you get to certain parts of the process, I really recommend you try Gitpod as well. Oh, and if you're building, so here's the difference, Jacob. We don't know in Codespaces yet. So Codespaces has a different plan and availability for people, but we don't know in Codespaces how to like set up an automated workspace for people, right? So, hey, we have a PR that came in, spin up a Codespace for that. I'm sure they'll get there, but we don't know about that yet. But Gitpod allows that, and then has a generous free tier. So that's been really great. But you can use Gitpod for your own project, right? So this is the one for Redwood, but you could be building your own product with just a Redwood app in Gitpod, the same thing. And that's where a lot of people are using Codespaces right now. So we do know people building on Redwood that are using Codespaces, and they also say it's a phenomenal experience. So when they're traveling, when they have low bandwidth, and you can also boost the container specs. So add more, virtual CPU, add more RAM. You can do that on Codespaces because you can pay for it there. I think it's well worth the price if you want to work inside of a virtual environment. They're really getting exceptional right now. And again, you can SSH into Codespaces or Gitpod from VS Code local and have a local virtual experience. All right, I'll stop talking about all this stuff. We're really excited. These things are coming together nicely, and it's making more people able to contribute to Redwood. So that's a little bit on all the, I'm kind of standing both Gitpod and Codespaces right now, and I should be, because they're great. I wanted to show you one other thing, which is when you are using the Redwood framework tools. I wanted to show you, should we go deeper into that? Remember right here, I did this. So look, I'm inside of the test project. This is important. I want to talk about syncing the projects again. Redwood framework. If I just run that, that's the command. And I could do help on that. If I don't do it, it'll pull up the same. And I just wanted to show you a few other things that are happening here. What this Redwood framework command is doing is it's a wrapper around all of these scripts. Okay, somebody tell me, where have you seen these scripts before? Anyone? Bueller? Actually, now I am concerned that no one's there. Am I still screen sharing?
Framework tools.
There you are. Okay. Yes, framework tools. So all of these commands, this is a wrapper for everything we saw here inside of framework tools. So it's effectively just a helper function right here. These were all the scripts that are right here. So that's what was showing up inside of framework tools. So when it says do project copy or project sync, right? That's where it is. So the word project sync encompasses project, the dependencies and the project copy. And the reason I want to point these things out is you may need to kind of surgically use these other commands. And again, a reminder of what they did. Project dependencies takes all of my dependencies in the framework, because I want to sync up these projects to test, and it installs all of those dependencies, not just the packages, Redwood packages, but like Webpack and Babel, every dependency we use, installs those in the test project. And you may need to update those. You could run project deps and it will update those in your test project. Copy is what takes the built packages in your framework local code base, and it copies the dist. So I have my package and I have a dist that's the built code, and it copies that over to my test project. That's what the copy command does. And sync is what sets the watcher, and it watches for changes in my framework code. And if there's any changes, it will rebuild and recopy those over. And those are the three commands that are happening when I run project sync. Project sync encompasses all those behind the scenes. And I haven't done that yet, so I would need to spin those up if I made any changes over here inside the framework code base. I would want to be spinning that up so I could see those in my test project, which is running right here. All right, I think that's good on the Redwood framework. Taking a look at my notes, what else haven't I covered regarding tooling? We've got CI, a little bit on keyboard shortcuts, a little bit on Windows problems you might have, local QA tools. I don't want to dive into debugging the Cypress E2E test right now. I think that'll be more confusing than helpful. But I showed you the Cypress tests and how to check them out. Okay, I think I covered all the tools you would need to know. The next thing to talk about is, what should I work on? I want to hit that topic, so a bit more high level, but very important, because it turns out if you don't know what to work on, none of these tools are going to help you anyway. But before I do, any other questions, anything else you would like to cover in the next, we've got a half hour left.
Yeah, so I noticed when you spun up the project on Gitpod that the test project or the test app actually kind of opened automatically.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of did the same for myself on Gitpod, but I didn't get my test project opening up for me. But the project was actually successfully opened up in Gitpod, but my no test project was opened up. So I wanted to know if maybe that was from my part, or maybe that was an issue.
Okay, I could show you how to open that preview. We can take a look at that again.
Okay, that'll be great.
Okay. Dom, did you have something?
No, I think
Okay.
you covered pretty much every which way
Okay.
you could do it.
Okay, great. All right, let's take 5. My timer's just about to go off. It's been 40 minutes again. Let's take another 5-minute break. So 5 or 4 minutes. So 5 past the hour, just make it easy. Take a break, get some coffee or water if you need it, and then we'll finish up at the half hour. We'll have 25 minutes left for open questions, but we're going to talk about how to get started. We'll talk about the community and any other questions that come up. And if we have time, any specific things you want to deep dive on, we can do that too. So I'll see you in, well, now it's 3 minutes or so. All right, take a break. Catch you soon. All right, let's talk about how to get started. And there's a few things I want to show you here. The first off is, really the way to get started with any Redwood project is through the community. So from RedwoodJS.com, I can't overstate how important it is to at least follow, if not get plugged into the community. It's a vibrant, helpful community, and you are welcome to be a part of it. It is based on reciprocity. So we are helping each other because we believe that's the best way that we can make Redwood successful. So we want you to be successful. There's Discourse. That's our forums. I'll open that tab. And there is Discord. So I could open up Discord, just click on those links. Discord is a great place to get started. It's ephemeral. Chat is easy. Discord is hot right now. It's a really easy place to come in. And I won't turn it on now, but just say hi. The Makers Hour meets there. Let people know what you want to do. And there will be people that want to help you do that. And that's all it takes as an introduction. The forums is where, my heart is for the forums, but this is our knowledge base. And the reason the forums is great, even though it's a little bit, there's more, barrier of entry because, things are more permanent. It feels a little bit more risky and vulnerable, but gosh, this is search the forums. It's a great knowledge base. There's a ton of code on the forums. Our announcements are happening here, which is another reason to follow. This is where you find out about new releases. You can, chat on things. And it also, when we are now around the world with our community, this is a great place to work asynchronously. And for a lot of people, if, you're not US based time zone, for example, Discord can be hard for you because, people are real timing and then conversations just gone. So use the forums for asynchronous communication. And also if you learn something, a wonderful way to contribute to the project is to share that snippet or that thing that you learned on the forums. You won't believe how helpful that can be, for months and maybe years to come by just sharing a simple, hey, look, I was trying to do this in Redwood. I figured it out. And here's how I did it. Here's a code snippet. We want that shared on the forums. But so many people who were sole developers got to build with a team because they joined the Redwood community. That's where you get started with anything in Redwood. All right. And start by reaching out to me. I'll help you get plugged in with people. I take time because that's the most valuable resource we've created. And the most valuable resource we have is our community. Documentation. You'll spend a lot of time on this website inside of our docs, but the place to get started is this contributing doc right here. We're going to be updating this with the Word document that I shared with you, but everything you need to know about what packages are what, where do I get started, what our code of conduct is, where do I find links to things that David showed me. All of that is here in this contributing doc. So take a look at that. Again, we'll be updating this with the Word document that I shared, but this is all a great place to help you get started as well. Redwood right now. So all of this is good, right? This is the resources you have to help you contribute. I've showed you the tools, but now where do you get started? You want to participate in Hacktoberfest, for example, and where do I start? So let me talk briefly about where Redwood is in the process of getting to version 1. We are close is the answer. This roadmap document walks you through all the different areas of development we've been in, gives you a status update on it, which is great. But the main thing is we are on the cusp within a version or two, within a release or two of launching our version 1 release candidate, which is a big deal for us. That's a huge milestone because that means we've added all the core features and we're not going to be adding any more core features until we get past version 1 fully released. And we've gotten all the breaking changes to get up to version 1 out of the way. So this is a really important milestone for us. And it also means we're having to strategically focus right now. So there's a link to the current release sprint there and elsewhere on the page, GitHub project board. But I want to show you how you can find out what the current status is about getting to version 1 and what we're working on, and use this project board to find issues that you could help out with. I'm taking one step back here, but if I go to the repo and click on projects, I see this current release sprint project with some information here about what we're working on, what the timelines are for things. Start here. If I click on current release sprint, now it takes me into the project board. And granted, there's a whole lot of things happening here. You don't have to pay attention to all of it. Just know that we are keeping this up to date and we are triaging it several times a week. Working right to left, you can see the things that are happening right now, in progress, that are priorities, about to get merged. Right, this is these are the things we're working left to right. So the things on the right side are things that are, about to go into the current release. Okay. And that's not where we need contributors in the community to be focusing, because all these things are, for the most part, someone's been assigned to them and they're being handled. So look here in these columns. We have an on deck help wanted column. Backlog PRs, those are currently open. You could help review, but maybe not as much looking in this column, although you could take a look and help nudge things along if they're needed, but this icebox column. So on deck and icebox, these are issues and tasks that we need help. And if you were to scroll through either of these and find anything you wanted to help with, it would be of high value to get us to version 1. If things are not on this project board, well, a couple situations could come to play. One, is it a bug or something from the latest release that needs to be updated or fixed or dealt with? Like, we need to get that in. But if you are bringing a new feature to Redwood that you're excited about, if you are doing something that may result in a break and change, we're at the stage in the project right now where we might not be able to get that into V1 because we have to have some strategic focus, and we're going to be pausing and waiting on some new features and some breaking changes until version 1 is released, which will be sometime at the early part of next year. So just know that if you have something else you want to work on that's not on the project board, we might not be able to get that PR in now, but let's talk about it. You open an issue and let us know what you want to work on, and we'll figure it out together. That's what collaboration is all about. All of these, well, let me actually pause there. So the things I was trying to say is, here is a place you can look on our project board for current status, and also to see where some issues or tasks are that need help right now. And then all of this adds up to us getting to version 1, first the release candidate, and then to a stable version 1 release. And that means something different for where we're at in the process, and new features or breaking changes that might come along from the way we want to update code. All of that needs to be on pause potentially until after V1, but let's talk about it in an issue. But just wanted to give you awareness of where we are in the V1 process. Any questions about those two things before I show you how to sort by these different labels, and also other ways you can find tasks to help with?
Yeah. So say I find an issue on the on deck section. So how do I know which particular issue doesn't already have someone working on it? Like, say I
Great.
understand the project. How do I know that somebody isn't already working on it?
Thank you. Great question. Let's do that right now. So I want to come in over here and look, I see people are assigned, right? And that may or may not mean that something's happening. This one is interesting because it does have a link pull request to it. And so, okay, if there's a pull request in progress, that's one way to know someone's working on it. But let's take a look at this one here. Change auth provider, no client, default value to null. So I'm going to click on that. Click on it again because I want to see the issue. And now I'm inside of all the issues that we have. And I want to show you how you can filter that by labels as well. But the best thing to do, and I believe that was Evans that asked the question, the best thing to do is look and read through the issue and see what the current status here is. And this one's interesting because Toth said that Toth 2000, I like that, said he was going to work on a PR soon. And well, that was back in August, right? So Evans, if this is of interest to you, the first thing you could do is just ask the question right here and say, checking in, is this still needed, right? Is this still needed? It seems stale, could I work on it, right? And that's a great way to check right there. It won't, like, we'll see these things coming through, and at least within a week, or if you nudge us again, we want to help let you know. We'll make sure we get back to you, but just ping us on that. So that's how you'd ask a question on this one, because I can see it went stale and it needs some help. The other thing is that there's no linked pull request here, Evans. So no one seems to be working on this right now, but typically, if you were to say, hey, could I work on this? It seems stale. I would reply back and say, oh, you bet, let's do it. Thanks for trying TOT 2000, but we really appreciate it. Let me know if you want to work on something else or if we mishandled this. And then I would assign this to you. All right, Evans, I would assign it to you up there. And then the next thing, oh, I took Dom off. So I think Dom might be taking a look at this, but also if you see a maintainer on this, that doesn't mean that we have time to work on it. So Dom's a part of our core team. So always ask, because Dom might be the right person to help guide the PR and help get you going. But that's happening inside of the issue. And then another thing is, don't hesitate to open a draft PR. A lot of projects want people to wait to iron things out in the issue until they open a PR and figure it all out. We've just found it's so much easier to work on questions and a problem when there's code to look at. So you'll notice there's a lot of drafts currently open right now. What that means is you don't have to have the whole thing solved. Get the conversation started, get the fixed duplicate, right? So I linked this in this one here. I linked it back so you'd see that's happening over there. This isn't done yet. I still have some work to do, but now I can ask my questions from the draft PR. And that might be another way to say, hey, it didn't look like anyone was working on this, so I'm taking a stab at it. Is that okay? So Evans, just ask. I probably overtalked that and made it sound harder than it is, but the bottom line is just ask. If you don't hear from us in a day or two, ask again. If it really looks like the thing isn't moving forward, you can create a draft PR because that's a great way to force the conversation and we'll figure it out from there. And that is absolutely okay. You really, culturally, we invite you to take steps forward. You really can't step on anybody's toes. If anything, it's our job as maintainers to sort those kind of things out and help you have ownership and move forward with the PR. Okay, I'll keep going on that. Issues. I wanted to go back to just starting from our issues. And I wanted to point out that there are some labels here to get you started if you just come to look. So if I click on good first issue, what that label means is we think these are contained issues that are accessible to people getting into the code base for the first time, right? It's not just about your skill level. It really is about how well contained it is and maybe a little bit about skill level, but that's the good issue label. The help wanted label is these are things that are valuable to us. I just clicked on and sorted by that. These are things that are valuable to the project. And right now, no one's assigned to do it. Anyone from the community would be welcome to participate. It might require more knowledge and experience, both of the project and development skills. But again, if you want to try something out, we would love to help you try. And a successful PR experience does not mean that the code gets merged. And this happens all the time. But the end goal is collaboration. The end goal is not the most perfect code in the world. The end goal is not that every PR gets merged. The end goal is collaboration. And as long as you're willing to go through some cycles with us and learn and improve collaboration and have a great optimal experience there, it's okay to try things out. We're fine with that. And actually, I do want to come back to that kind of what makes a great PR and great PR experience. We'll end with that. So that's help wanted. We have the Hacktoberfest label and another really important label. Don't worry about the V1 for consideration. That's how things get put on the board is the bug label. So back over here, bug confirmed and anything that has a, oh, it's adding more up here. Let me just sort by bug confirmed only. Anything that has a bug confirmed label on it, we want to get that resolved, or at least even find out if it's really still an issue for version 1. So you'll see we have a lot of these to look through, a couple pages worth, and anything that has bug on it is something that needs to be addressed. If your contribution to the project is purely to validate whether a bug is still a bug, that is really helpful to us. So don't hesitate to get into one of these and just try it out and see if the bug still exists, and then update the issue, because that really helps the project move forward as well. Questions about labels and finding issues? Okay. Another way to get started in this project is to go to Discord or Discourse, our forums, and go to the contributors sections in either of those, right? Look right here, contributing, and just say, hey, I am looking to get started in Redwood as a contributor. Does anyone have anything I could help work on right now, or any ideas? Like what needs to be done right now? And that's a great way to get started, and a great way to begin collaboration with the community. So don't hesitate to start there as well. And we might not always have an answer, but oftentimes we can at least direct you towards someone who might know, or we'll keep you in mind when something you're interested in working on is something that needs to be worked on, right? Because I understand there's some things that you're going to be more inspired to work on than others, and we want to try and help make that match too. Questions? All right. Lastly, what makes for a great PR? Dom, are you still there?
Yeah.
All right, Dom. As a maintainer and as someone that's created a lot of PRs, what makes for a great PR?
Yeah, I think it's mostly in the work put into the description in the post, like explaining the problem, like the approach took to solve it. Like not even like, obviously like the more readable the code is, the better, but sometimes like things will always be a little obscure no matter what. So just like explaining like what you did, how you got there, what you couldn't figure out, or what you want us to review, like just giving us like pretty much every pointer you can really helps. And just being ready to have a conversation too is awesome, like because we like to have a lot of back and forths, and sometimes we just want to try things out or give feedback, and it's never like that. Just yeah, I don't know, ready to be a part of the community more or less. I think you're still on mute, David.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Those are all good things. So remember that a successful PR experience does not mean that, here's what it's not. It's not the most intelligent, sophisticated code in the world. And as a matter of fact, it's probably not a lot of code. Sometimes it needs to be, but having things be much more modular, smaller, and readable, understandable code that helps other people contribute in the future is much more desired than really elegant, sophisticated, like latest methods, whatever. Like that's all great, but if it's not understandable, it's not great. So we welcome it all, but that's not what makes a PR great. And not every PR is going to get merged either. A lot of PRs go through cycles, and that's okay too, because we're learning, we're iterating and trying to move things forward, which may mean starting over and opening another PR. So just know that that's all okay. That's a great part of the experience, because a PR is just a way to collaborate and have conversations. So let's go here first. David Tierson, he is giving some information about this PR, and right, giving some background on what we're trying to do. He linked to the new changes in the Prisma seed database, gave us a to-do list of what's going on. And so he's leaving a bread trail. And as he walks through, this was a draft PR for quite a while. He's providing information, status updates as he goes. He just converted this out of a draft. So he said it was ready for review, and added me as a reviewer to let me know that now is the time to get review help on this. Some other things that could be missing here are, he could have said at the David Price here in the original post, based on our conversation, I'm opening this up, please take a look. It's still in draft. So he could have looped me in. When you're opening a PR, feel free to tag somebody, or tag me if you don't know who to tag, if you have questions. That's a great thing to do. Typically there's an issue, this one didn't have one, that you'd be linked to. and you would say this PR relates to this issue, or it fixes or closes this issue. And that's how you get the linked relationship between them. It helps someone who looks at the issue know that there's a PR in progress, and all the conversation is probably happening in the PR now. So that's another thing that could have been updated. And let's look over here. And by the way, Peter's been incredible to work with. So I've been going back and forth with him, and this is great. But in this PR, right, if someone's coming through and looking for context, now they do have to go back to this, but he linked to what was happening. And here's the description back in the actual issue. So I could go there and see what could be more helpful here. So imagine this is now committed, and the next release comes out, and someone is going through the release notes for version 38, and they see this new shadow emptying and like, oh, I want to see the PR. So imagine they're coming back and reading the PR, having a description here about what this PR does, and giving a copy of the syntax is also really helpful. Like, hey, here's what this is trying to add to the code base. It's going to be adding a setup command to create a CLI alias when you run yarn Redwood, right? That would be a helpful description here. And that could help. It's communication on this PR. And yeah, we'll ask questions. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but giving a breadcrumb, looping someone in, a description and copies of syntax as you go, all those things are really helpful things to add to a PR when you open them up. And I think that's about it for topics. And also, we are at the 2-hour mark. Oh, look at you all still here. So, you know what? Opening a PR, the hardest part is just getting it open. Make it a draft. Let us know why it exists, and we'll ask questions. You can update the description as you go. But having concerns about opening the PR, like doing all those things right, is not a concern. Just get a PR open, and we'll guide you from there. Thank you all for joining me wherever you are in the world on this 2-hour journey. Really appreciate it. I don't take your time for granted. The fact that you would show up with a stranger on the internet and give 2 hours of your time to learn how to do this Redwood stuff is really meaningful. And it's what makes being a part of this project so much fun for me. This is a start. It does not end here. I am available, and I can't always be the one to answer your questions, but I'm always excited to help you take a next step. So if you have a question, you can DM me, tag me on the forums or discourse, and I would love to get you pointed at the next person. We have 17 people on the Redwood core team right now, and we want that to keep growing. And all those people were just like you. You know, we've been around barely a year and a half, going on 2, and they just started showing up and helping out. They were enthusiastic about the project. Dom showed up and said, hey, can I write docs? And Dom became our Doc Master 9000, and he's done a phenomenal job. And now he's been bringing in some major features. But we want anyone who wants to be a participant to be able to do so. We have contributors meetups that I could invite you to. And if I see that you're active, and that's a smaller group that we try to meet at least once a month. And then the core team is available to anyone as well. And I could talk about what we're looking for there, but you don't have to be 20 years of experience as a developer. We're just looking for people that are available, want to have some ownership and some leadership over part of the community and the project, and have just been able to join and be faithful over, months and for a period of time. So there are some commitments that come with that, but anyone that wants to be a part of the core team, just as anyone that wants to be a contributor, we want to make that accessible. Anyone who wants to be a part of the core team, like this is the beginning of that journey. It's available. But there's no expectations on that. Go build your startup, right? We want to help you do that too.